Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku was the vessel of a resurrected Kryptonian spirit. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The first sound was a groan. Not of a living thing, but of a world in its death throes. Val-El stood amidst the silent hum of his laboratory, a stark contrast to the planetary agony shuddering through the crystalline floors beneath his feet. Outside the transparent psychoreactive walls of his spire, the sky of Krypton was a tapestry of burning crimson and violent ochre. Ra, their great sun, was no longer a benevolent god of light but a bloated, rabid star, spewing death across the system it had once nurtured. He ignored the tremors. He ignored the distant, percussive booms of entire cities collapsing into the molten core of the planet. His focus was singular, narrowed to the object hovering in the stasis field before him, a shard of obsidian crystal, no larger than his fist, swirling with an internal, nebula-like light. A Genesis crystal. All systems nominal, a calm, synthesized voice announced from the lab's integrated consciousness. Cognitive imprint complete. Biodata and historical archives compressed and encoded. Val-El ran a hand over his tired face, the lines of exhaustion carved deep around his eyes. He was of the House of El, a name synonymous with scientific brilliance and leadership, but he was from a lesser branch, a quiet lineage of bioengineers and archivists. While his more famous cousin, Jor-El, had gambled everything on a single, desperate vessel to save a life, Val-El had pursued a different, perhaps more arrogant, path. He had tried to save them all. His project, the Kronos Protocol, was a failure. A grand, spectacular failure that had consumed his life's work. It was a plan to create a planetary stasis field, a bioshield that would encase Krypton and its people in a single moment of time, protecting them from Rao's final, explosive tantrum. He had theorized he could suspend their very cellular existence until the danger had passed. He had been wrong. The energy calculations were too vast, the physics too unstable. The planet's core had destabilized faster than his models predicted. He had failed. That single word was a brand on his soul. Warning, the lab's voice intoned, its placid tone a chilling counterpoint to the message. Planetary structural integrity at 4%. Core collapse imminent. Evacuation is no longer possible. Val-El looked at the Genesis crystal. It was not a vessel for a body, but for a mind. For a culture. It contained everything, the full scope of their science, their art, their history, and the ghost of his own consciousness, a psychic echo meant to serve as a guide. It was a message in a bottle thrown into a cosmic ocean, a last, desperate prayer that something of Krypton might survive. Not its people, but its memory. He reached forward, his fingers tracing the humming field. Guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, making each breath a laborious chore. He saw the face of his wife, Lyra, in his mind's eye. He had sent her and their daughter away to Kanda weeks ago, promising he was on the verge of a breakthrough, promising to join them soon. Kanda was now nothing more than superheated dust. Another violent quake shook the spire, and a spiderweb of cracks raced across the far wall. The red glare of Rao intensified, bathing the lab in the color of blood. Launch sequence initiated, the computer stated. A section of the ceiling retracted, revealing the apocalyptic sky. A focused magnetic field locked onto the crystal, lifting it from its stasis cradle. Val-El placed a hand on the cool, smooth surface of the crystal for a fleeting second. He poured every last ounce of his regret, his sorrow, and a tiny, defiant flicker of hope into that touch. Find a strong sun, he whispered, his voice hoarse. Find a young world. Find a vessel worthy of hope, not one who personifies failure. With a soundless, frictionless surge, the Genesis crystal shot upwards, a tiny black speck against the dying, red sun. It pierced the roiling atmosphere and disappeared into the void. Val-El stood alone, watching the space where it had been. He did not move as the final groan of the planet became a deafening roar, as the crystalline floor beneath him shattered into a million pieces. As the fire of his world rose to consume him, his last thought was not of science, nor of survival. It was the simple, two-word epitaph for his entire existence, a name and a verdict. El failed. 10 years ago. Izuku Midoriya sat on the squeaky examination chair, his legs dangling a good foot above the floor. He was 4 years old, a tiny vessel of boundless energy and a single, all-consuming dream. The room smelled of antiseptic and disappointment. The doctor, a kindly man with a weary face and a large, bushy mustache, swiveled in his chair. He tapped a glowing X-ray image on the screen, pointing to a small, almost insignificant detail in Izuku's left foot. "You see this, Mrs. Midoriya," he said, his voice gentle but firm, like a soft blanket smothering a tiny flame. "Most people have evolved past this. In the age of quirks, the pinky toe joint is considered a vestigial trait. Izuku has 2 joints. It's a very reliable indicator." Inko Midoriya stood beside the chair, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. "An indicator of what, doctor?" she asked, though the tremor in her voice suggested she already knew the answer. "It means he's quirkless," the doctor said, finally looking at Izuku. "I'm sorry, kid, but it's not going to happen. You're not going to develop a quirk." The words didn't seem real. They were just sounds, like the buzz of the fluorescent lights above or the quiet hum of the computer. Izuku stared at the doctor, then at his mother. Her face was crumpling, her eyes welling with a tide of sorrow that was all for him. Then, he looked at the computer screen on the wall behind the doctor's desk. It was paused on a news site, but in the corner of the screen was an advertisement featuring a familiar, beaming smile, 2 victory sign antennae of golden hair, and the bright, heroic colors of the #1 hero, All Might. The dream, which had been a brilliant sun in his heart, flickered. The walk home was a blur. The ride home in the car was silent. The moment they stepped into their apartment, the fragile dam of Inko's composure broke. Later that night, Izuku sat in his little computer chair, the room dark save for the light of the monitor. He was watching it. The video. The one he always watched. The shaky, amateur footage of All Might's debut. A mountain of a man carrying a dozen people on his back, laughing in the face of a disaster. "He's laughing!" the unseen cameraman shouted in the video. Izuku's small body trembled. He wanted to be like that. He needed to be like that. It was the only thing he had ever truly wanted. He slowly turned his chair around. His mother stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the hallway light. Tears streamed down her face, catching the light from the screen. "Mom," he began, his own voice small and wavering. "He saves everyone with a smile, no matter what trouble they're in. He's such a cool hero." He pointed a shaky finger at the screen, then looked at his mother, his own eyes now giant, glistening pools of unshed tears. The question was a desperate plea, the last prayer of a dying faith. "Can I be a hero too?" Inko rushed forward, falling to her knees and wrapping him in a hug that felt like it was made of broken glass. Her sobs were loud in the quiet room. "I'm sorry, Izuku," she cried, her words muffled in his shoulder. "I'm so sorry." They were not the words he wanted to hear. They were not the words he needed to hear. In that moment, the flickering sun in his heart went out, leaving behind a cold, dark void. He didn't cry. He just sat there, limp in his mother's arms, and stared at the smiling hero on the screen. The next few days were a haze of quiet sympathy and gentle pity. His mother looked at him with sad eyes. The kids at the playground, led by his best friend, Katsuki Bakugo, looked at him with a new kind of expression. He was no longer just Deku, the useless one. He was Deku, the scientifically proven, officially diagnosed useless one. He was a relic. An oddity. One afternoon, unable to bear the weight of his mother's sorrow or Kaken's derision, he did something he rarely did. He wandered off. He walked past the edge of the playground, past the last row of houses, and into the small, dense patch of woods that bordered their neighborhood. He walked with no destination, his All Might figurine clutched tightly in his hand. He was trying to outrun the doctor's words, his mother's tears, Kaken's explosive laughter. The woods were quiet, the light of the late afternoon filtering through the canopy in dappled patterns. It was peaceful. Here, he was just Izuku, not the quirkless kid. He sat down on a mossy log, tracing the lines on his action figure's plastic face. Why? Why him? What had he done wrong? It was then that the sky changed. A sliver of impossible darkness streaked across the twilight blue, like a tear in the fabric of the sky. It wasn't a meteor, which would have burned bright and orange. This was a line of pure black, absorbing the light around it, followed by a trailing whisper of purple-white energy. It moved with a soundless shriek of speed, an unnatural violation of the quiet evening. Izuku scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding with a child's mix of fear and wonder. He watched as the dark line angled down, disappearing behind a small hill deeper in the woods. A second later there was a muffled thump, a sound less like an explosion and more like a giant punching the earth. The ground beneath his feet vibrated, and a puff of displaced air rustled the leaves around him. Curiosity, that powerful, indefatigable engine of childhood, overwhelmed his grief. He forgot his sadness, his diagnosis, his shattered dream. He was an explorer now. He ran, his small legs pumping, tripping over roots and pushing past low-hanging branches, towards the hill. He smelled it before he saw it, the scent of ozone and freshly turned earth. He crested the hill and looked down into a small clearing. There, in the center, was a scar. A small crater, no more than 10 feet across, black soil thrown up in a neat circle. It looked like a wound in the world, and in the very center of the wound, nestled in the dirt, was a star. Or at least, that's what his 4-year-old mind called it. It was a crystalline object, the size of a large apple, shaped like a rough, multifaceted shard. Its surface was the black of a starless void, a perfect, light-devouring black that seemed to drink the twilight. But from deep within, a faint, internal light pulsed with the slow, steady rhythm of a sleeping heart. A soft, low hum vibrated in the air around it, a note so deep he felt it in his bones more than he heard it with his ears. He slid down the loose dirt of the crater's edge, his sneakers sinking into the soft soil. He approached it cautiously, his earlier fear returning. It was beautiful and terrifying. It felt lonely. He crouched down, his face inches from the strange object. The humming grew a little louder, the internal light a little brighter, as if it were aware of his presence. He could see tiny, swirling patterns within its depths, like galaxies being born and dying in an endless cycle. It was the most amazing thing he had ever seen. He reached out a hesitant hand. His mother's voice echoed in his head, "Don't touch strange things, Izuku." But the pull was irresistible. It was a magnet for his despair, a beacon in the darkness that had consumed his world. The moment his small, trembling fingertip made contact with the crystal's impossibly smooth, cool surface, reality broke. It was not a flash of light. It was a flood. 1,000,000,000 years of starlight, the crushing gravity of a dying world, the silent screams of a lost civilization, the complex bitterness of a genius's failure, all of it surged through that single point of contact. It was not data, it was experience. He felt the phantom quakes of a planet's death throes. He saw the face of a bloated, red sun. He heard a voice whisper a name and a verdict. L failed. The power was a tidal wave of raw, untamed energy, a force designed to fuel a star, now pouring into the thimble-sized vessel of a 4-year-old boy. His nerves lit up like a switchboard hit by a lightning strike. His cells, his very DNA, screamed as they were forcibly rewritten by an alien blueprint. The pain was absolute. It was a fire that consumed him from the inside out, turning his bones to glass and his blood to lava. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. The world snapped back into focus for a split second before dissolving into darkness. Izuku Midoriya collapsed, his small body falling limp beside the alien crystal, which now pulsed with a soft, steady, green light. He was unconscious before he even hit the ground. He woke up to the smell of his mother's katsudon and the feeling of his own bed. It was dark outside. He sat up, his head throbbing with a dull ache. For a moment he thought he had dreamed it all, the woods, the crater, the black star. But then he felt it. A strange, low-level thrumming deep in his chest, like the echo of the crystal's hum. His body felt different. The air tasted sharper. The colors in his room seemed more vibrant. His mother found him sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at his hands. She hugged him tightly, scolding him through relieved tears for wandering off and worrying her so much. A search party had found him asleep in the woods, she said. He was lucky he hadn't caught a cold. He didn't tell her about the falling star. He didn't know how. What would he say? That he touched a magic rock and it hurt him? She was already so worried. So, he kept it a secret. A strange, painful dream he was slowly convincing himself wasn't real. A few days later, the dream came roaring back to life. He was at the park, trying to exist on the periphery. But trouble, as it often did, found him. Bakugo and his 2 lackeys had cornered another kid and were trying to take his toy. Izuku, as he always did, intervened. "Stop it, Kaken," he said, his voice barely a squeak. He moved to stand between Bakugo and the crying boy, his arms spread wide in a miniature, trembling imitation of All Might. "If you don't stop, I'll never forgive you." Bakugo just laughed, a cruel, barking sound. "Still playing hero, Deku? You're quirkless. You're less than nothing. What are you gonna do?" He shoved Izuku hard in the chest. It was the same push he'd endured 100 times before. Normally, he would have stumbled back, fallen, and maybe scraped his knee. This time was different. As Bakugo's hand made contact, a coil of something hot and tight in Izuku's chest snapped. It wasn't a thought. It wasn't a decision. It was pure, primal instinct, a reflexive flinch against a perceived threat. He pushed back. His hand shot out and met Bakugo's chest. There was no sense of muscular effort. One moment, his arm was moving. The next, a profound and impossible amount of force was unleashed. It was as if he hadn't pushed Bakugo, but had instead pushed the world away from him. Katsuki Bakugo, who was bigger and stronger and prided himself on his physical power, went flying. He didn't just stumble. His feet left the ground, and he sailed backwards a good 10 feet, landing in a heap with a shocked oof. Everyone froze. The other boys stared, their jaws hanging open. Bakugo looked up from the ground, his usual arrogant fury replaced by sheer, dumbfounded disbelief. Izuku stared at his own hand, his eyes wide with terror. Then came the cost. A searing, blinding pain shot up his arm, as if every bone from his fingertips to his shoulder had been replaced with superheated needles. It was not the dull ache of a sprain or the sharp crack of a break. It was a sharp, crystalline shattering, a feeling of being torn apart on a cellular level. He screamed, a high, thin wail of agony, clutching his arm to his chest. Simultaneously, a wave of heat washed over his face, and something warm and wet gushed from his nose. He brought his free hand up to his face, and it came away smeared with bright, shocking red. Blood, a lot of it. It dripped from his chin onto the front of his yellow t-shirt, a stark, horrifying stain. He looked at Bakugo, then at the blood on his hand, then at the arm that was screaming with an alien pain. This wasn't a quirk. Quirks were cool. Quirks made heroes. This was a monster living inside him. A monster that hurt him whenever it came out. Fear, cold and absolute, washed over him. He turned and ran. He ran from Bakugo's confused shout, from the stares of the other kids, from the evidence of what he'd done. He ran from the power, from the pain, from the terrifying secret that now lived in his bones. 10 years passed in a blink and an eternity. The secret remained buried, locked away in the deepest part of him. Izuku Midoriya doubled down on his diagnosis. He was quirkless. He clung to it like a shield. When people called him Deku, when they looked at him with pity or contempt, a part of him was relieved. It was better than them looking at him with fear. It was better than them knowing about the horrible, painful thing he kept hidden. The power never manifested so dramatically again. He learned to suppress it, to smother the instinct. But it was always there. A low thrum of energy beneath his skin, a foreign presence in his own body. It became a chronic condition, a part of his daily existence. He was tired. Always. It was a deep, cellular fatigue that no amount of sleep could ever truly fix. His body was a constant, low-grade war zone. His human cells, fighting a losing battle against the Kryptonian energy that sought to supercharge them, were perpetually breaking down and being rebuilt. It left him with aches in his joints that felt like an old man's arthritis, sporadic migraines that would blind him with shimmering light, and a constant, humming anxiety that he could never quite shake. He learned to live with it. He learned to manage his energy, to know when to push himself and when to retreat. It made him quiet, observant, and perpetually hunched, as if trying to make himself smaller to contain the stellar power raging within him. His obsession with heroes evolved. It was still rooted in pure, unadulterated admiration for figures like All Might, but it now had a second, more desperate purpose. It became a research project. His notebooks, famous among his classmates as the sad hobby of a hero wannabe, were something else entirely to him. On the surface, Hero Analysis for the Future, number 13 looked like any other. It had a detailed drawing of the new hero, MT Lady, on the cover. Inside were pages dedicated to her debut, her gigantification quirk, its presumed applications, and potential weaknesses. But in the margins, in tiny, almost illegible script, were Izuku's real questions. Energy source for mass increase? Obeys conservation of mass? Or draws from an external source? Cellular strain must be immense. Side effects? Chronic pain? Fatigue? How does her body contain the energy required without breaking down? He analyzed Endeavor's hell flame, not just for its power, but for its thermoregulation. How did his body withstand such temperatures? Was it a secondary quirk, or part of the primary one? He studied Eraserhead's strange quirk, wondering about the biological mechanism behind nullifying another's power. He was looking for answers. He was searching for a reflection, however faint, of his own condition in the pantheon of Earth's superhumans. If he could just understand how they managed their power, how their bodies contained such incredible forces, maybe he could understand the curse that lived inside him. Maybe he could find a way to control it without it breaking him. Or, failing that, maybe he could find a hero whose power came with a similar, terrible cost, just so he wouldn't feel so utterly alone. He never found one. Every hero, no matter how strange their power, seemed to exist in a state of biological harmony. Their bodies were meant for their quirks. His was not. He was a faulty vessel, a cracked cup trying to hold the power of an ocean. On a bright Tuesday morning, as he walked to Aldera Junior High, a familiar ache throbbed in his right arm, a phantom echo of the pain from a decade ago. He absent-mindedly rubbed his shoulder, his eyes downcast as he navigated the sidewalk. A news report about a villain attack downtown played on a storefront television, and he paused for a moment, his analytical mind kicking in automatically. Kamui Woods, a fast-growing hero with a powerful arboreal quirk. Izuku watched him swing into action, his wooden limbs extending with grace and power. He saw the heroism. He saw the adoring crowd. But he also saw a seamless fusion of man and power, a biological miracle he knew he could never have. He clutched the strap of his yellow backpack, the worn All Might keychain attached to it clinking softly. The dream was still there, buried under a decade of pain, fear, and scientific certainty. The dream of being a hero. It was a foolish, impossible dream for a quirkless boy. And it was an even more dangerous dream for a boy who wasn't quirkless at all, but was instead the living vessel for the broken legacy of a dead star, a power that threatened to burn him out from the inside with every beat of his all-too-human heart. He took a deep, steadying breath and continued on his way to school, the low, familiar hum of alien energy a constant, secret companion in the quiet solitude of his soul. The school day at Aldera Junior High was, for Izuku Midoriya, a masterclass in endurance. It wasn't the academics that wore him down, nor the constant, low-level bullying that simmered around him like heat off summer asphalt. It was the simple, draining act of existing. He sat at his desk, pretending to be engrossed in the history lesson about the pre-quirk era, but his focus was turned inward. He was conducting his usual morning inventory of aches. There was the familiar, dull throb in his lower back, a constant companion. A sharper, more insistent pain was nested behind his right kneecap, a souvenir from tripping on the stairs yesterday. And overarching it all was the fatigue, a profound, bone-deep weariness that felt less like sleepiness and more like his body's battery was perpetually stuck at 5%. He surreptitiously pressed his knuckles into his left thigh, trying to work out a knot of pain that had been building since breakfast. It was a constant balancing act, managing the invisible burden of his condition. He had learned to move with a certain deliberate slowness, to avoid sudden exertion, to ration his energy like a castaway with a single canteen of water. To his classmates, he was just clumsy, timid Deku. To himself, he was a man walking a tightrope over a chasm of pain. The bell shrieked, signaling the end of the period. As students began to shuffle and chatter, Izuku remained seated, slowly gathering his things. He needed a moment for the throbbing in his leg to subside. Still scribbling in that creepy stalker journal, Deku? The voice was sharp, explosive, and far too close. Izuku flinched, instinctively hunching over his notebook as if to protect it from a physical blow. Katsuki Bakugo loomed over his desk, a sneer plastered across his face. It's not a stalker journal, Kaken, Izuku mumbled to the desk. It's analysis. For the future. Future? What future? Bakugo scoffed, snatching the notebook with lightning speed. The future where you get a job cleaning hero statues? A quirkless nobody like you doesn't have a future. Izuku's heart hammered against his ribs. A jolt of something hot and volatile flared in his chest, the slumbering monster stirring in its cage. He felt a phantom strength twitch in his muscles, a dangerous impulse to snatch the notebook back with a force that would send Bakugo flying, just like it had all those years ago. No. Don't. Remember the pain. Remember the blood. He forcefully suppressed it, the effort making him feel dizzy and nauseous. He clamped down on the power, strangling it before it could manifest. The backlash was purely internal this time. A fresh wave of exhaustion washed over him, and the ache in his head sharpened into a distinct, pulsing migraine behind his eyes. Give it back, please, he managed, his voice weak. Bakugo flipped through the pages with theatrical disdain. Pathetic, he grunted, before tossing the notebook back onto the desk. It landed with a soft thud. Stop dreaming, Deku. It's just sad. With that, he turned and stalked away, his cronies snickering in his wake. Izuku waited until they were gone before he finally let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He gingerly touched his forehead, the pain now a bright, sharp spike. This was his life, a constant war fought on two fronts. The external world, which saw him as worthless, and the internal world, where a single misstep could unleash a power that would tear him apart. He trudged through the rest of the day in a fog of pain and fatigue. By the time he got home, every step felt like he was wading through wet cement. He gave his mother a weak smile, mumbled something about a long day, and retreated to the sanctuary of his bedroom. He didn't even have the energy to turn on his computer. He just collapsed onto his bed, face down, fully clothed, and let the darkness take him. Sleep, for Izuku, was rarely a peaceful affair. It was usually a chaotic landscape of disjointed nightmares, filled with faceless bullies, falling from great heights, and the ever-present, low-grade thrum of pain that followed him even into his subconscious. Tonight, it started the same. A swirling gray miasma of anxiety. But then, something changed. The gray began to resolve. The formless dread began to coalesce. A sound emerged from the usual muffled silence of his dreams, a low, humming static, like a radio tuned between stations. It grew in volume, a persistent shhhhhhhh that seemed to vibrate inside his skull. The scene around him shifted. He was no longer floating in an undefined void. He was standing. His feet were bare against a floor that was cool, smooth, and crystalline. It stretched out in every direction, a polished black surface that reflected a sky that wasn't a sky. Above him was not blackness, but a breathtaking, swirling nebula of cosmic dust and distant, alien stars. He looked around, his dream self filled with a sense of clarity he rarely felt even when awake. He was in a vast, circular room. The walls, if they could be called that, were towering constructs of the same black crystal, interwoven with conduits that pulsed with a faint, inner light. The architecture was all wrong, all sharp angles and impossible curves, a style that felt ancient and profoundly non-human. In the center of the room, a massive holographic sphere of a star system hung in the air, its planets rotating in silent, graceful orbits. All around the room were workstations, consoles, and platforms, all made of the same humming crystal. But the place was a ruin. Giant cracks ran through the walls and floor, some of them weeping a slow, dim light, like blood from a wound. Sections of the ceiling had collapsed, littering the floor with crystalline debris. The holographic star map flickered erratically, entire planets vanishing and reappearing in bursts of static. The air tasted of ozone and ancient dust. It felt like a king's tomb, a cathedral built to honor a dead god. It felt like failure. Where am I? Izuku whispered, his voice sounding small and thin in the immense space. A more precise question would be what you are perceiving, a voice answered. The voice was not in the room. It was in his head. It was calm, deep, and carried an ancient weariness. It was layered with the same humming static that filled the air, as if it were being broadcast from an immeasurable distance. Izuku spun around, his heart pounding. Who's there? Who said that? In front of the flickering star map, the air began to shimmer. Particles of light and static coalesced, swirling together like iron filings drawn to a magnet. They slowly formed a figure, a tall, humanoid shape that was translucent and unsteady, like a hologram with a faulty projector. The being was humanoid, but distinctly alien. He was tall and lean, with sharp, aristocratic features and dark hair slicked back from a high forehead. He wore a high-collared tunic marked with a strange, stylized S-like crest, though it was different from the one on All Might's chest, more severe and geometric. His form was composed entirely of shifting, shimmering blue-white light and crackling static, and his eyes were pools of deep, cosmic sorrow. He looked at Izuku not as one would look at another person, but as a scientist would look at a surprising, and possibly disappointing, lab result. I am a psychic echo, the spectral figure said, his voice resonating within Izuku's mind. A cognitive imprint. A ghost in your machine, so to speak. You may call me Val-El. Izuku stared, his mouth agape. A ghost? A dream? This felt too real, too coherent for a dream. The cold floor beneath his feet, the deep hum in the air, the sheer, crushing scale of the place. It was all too tangible. Val-El? Izuku stammered. I don't understand. Is this a quirk? Are you a quirk? The figure's expression soured, a flicker of what might have been contempt crossing his translucent features. Quirk, he repeated the word as if it were a distasteful morsel, a primitive term for a chaotic and unpredictable biological phenomenon. No. I am not a quirk. I am what is left of a man from a world that is no more, and this place, he gestured vaguely at the crumbling laboratory. This is a construct. A mind palace, built from the dregs of my memories and the architecture of your own subconscious. It is our shared space. Izuku's mind reeled. A world that is no more? Shared space? His gaze darted around the room, landing on the strange, alien script that flickered across a nearby console. It was a language he had never seen, yet on some fundamental level, he could almost understand it. The falling star, Izuku whispered, the memory from 10 years ago surfacing with sudden, painful clarity. The black crystal. The flash of light. The searing pain. That was you. It was the vessel that contained me, Val-El corrected, his form drifting closer. He moved without walking, gliding over the crystalline floor. A Genesis crystal, encoded with the totality of my civilization's knowledge and a fragment of my own consciousness. It was a last, desperate act of preservation. It was not intended to be found by a child. The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture so terrifying and insane that Izuku felt a wave of vertigo. The chronic fatigue. The constant pain. The unnatural strength he had to keep chained. What did you do to me? Izuku asked, his voice trembling with a decade of fear and confusion. What is this thing inside me? This power that hurts me? Val-El raised a translucent hand, and the flickering star map behind him dissolved. It was replaced by a new hologram, one that Izuku recognized with a jolt of horror, a detailed, rotating model of a human double helix. His DNA. The Genesis crystal's primary function upon encountering a viable biological host under a young, yellow star was to initiate a process of genetic imprinting, Val-El explained, his tone shifting to that of a lecturer. It rewrote your cellular structure on a fundamental level. Your cells, human though they may be, were given a Kryptonian blueprint. He gestured again, and a second hologram appeared beside the DNA, a diagram of a human cell. My people evolved under the light of a red supergiant, Rao. Under the radiation of a younger, yellow star, such as your sun, our cells become highly efficient photoreactive batteries. They absorb and metabolize solar radiation, converting it into immense energy. A line of light traveled from a crude drawing of the sun to the cell, which began to glow with a bright, golden energy. This energy grants the body abilities that would seem godlike to a primitive civilization, Val-El continued. Superhuman strength, speed, durability, the ability to defy gravity. So, it's a good thing? Izuku asked, a tiny, insane flicker of hope igniting in the void of his fear. Strength? Speed? Flight? Like All Might? Valel's sorrowful eyes met his. No, child. It is a death sentence. The hologram changed again. The glowing human cell began to shudder. Cracks of red, angry light appeared on its surface. It swelled, pulsed erratically, and then ruptured, dissolving into static. Your biology is fundamentally incompatible, Valel stated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Your human cellular structure is not designed to contain such energies. Think of your body as a biological nuclear reactor. My body would have been a reactor with 10 feet of reinforced containment shielding. Yours. He paused, letting the weight of the word sink in. Yours has no shielding at all. The truth crashed down on Izuku with the force of a physical blow. The constant pain wasn't just pain. It was the sound of his cells tearing themselves apart. The fatigue wasn't just tiredness. It was the energy his body expended trying to heal the microscopic radiation damage that was happening every second of every day. The nosebleed, the shattered feeling in his arm all those years ago. It was all cellular degradation. He wasn't just sick. He was decaying. The power supercharges your cells, yes, but it also poisons them, Valel clarified, as if sensing Izuku's thoughts. It burns them out. Every time you use even a fraction of that strength, you are accelerating the process. You are pulling the fuel rods out of the reactor with your bare hands. The resulting cellular decay is extensive. Nerve damage, internal hemorrhaging, bone degradation. It is a slow, agonizing process of coming apart. Izuku stumbled backwards, his dream legs feeling weak. He sank to the crystalline floor, his head in his hands. He wasn't quirkless. He was cursed. He was a walking, talking biological time bomb. Why? Izuku choked out, tears he couldn't physically shed burning in his dream eyes. Why me? You were simply there, Valel said, a hint of his own ancient guilt coloring his tone. A random variable in a desperate equation. A vessel of convenience. I died with the weight of my world's extinction on my soul. It seems my failure is a ghost that will haunt you as well. For a long moment, silence reigned in the crumbling mind palace, broken only by the hum of the static and the faint, rhythmic pulse of the dying machinery. Izuku's mind was a maelstrom of terror and despair. Everything he thought he knew about himself was a lie. His greatest weakness wasn't his lack of a quirk, but the presence of a power that was actively unmaking him. But then, through the storm of his fear, a single, stubborn thought emerged. The thought that had defined his entire existence. The dream that refused to die. He looked up at the spectral scientist, his eyes filled with a desperate, new light. Can I control it? He asked, his voice shaking. You're a scientist. You're from this Krypton. You must know how. If I can learn to control it, if I can stop it from breaking me, can I use it? Valel's translucent form flickered. He looked down at the small, determined boy, and for the first time, a clear emotion crossed his face, utter, profound disbelief, mixed with something akin to pity. Use it? He repeated, the words dripping with a cynicism honed by the annihilation of a species. For what? To what end? To play hero? To save people? Izuku shot back, scrambling to his feet. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was now joined by a fierce, defiant spark. To be like All Might, to save people with a smile and tell them that everything is going to be okay. Valel let out a sound that was not quite a laugh. It was a dry, static-filled burst of air, devoid of all humor. Heroism. An infantile concept. A fantasy your species entertains to distract from its own inherent self-destructive tendencies. I have seen civilizations rise and fall. I have watched my own people, a society of scientific gods, tear themselves apart with political infighting and willful ignorance, as their world died around them. He gestured, and the holograms shifted again, showing terrifying, fleeting images. A city of breathtaking crystalline spires crumbling into a sea of fire. People in strange, elegant robes running in terror. A red sun swelling in a dying sky. We were a race of heroes, by your definition, Valel said, his voice laced with venomous self-loathing. And our heroism did not save us. Our science did not save us. Our hope was a disease that blinded us to the inevitable. Do not speak to me of saving people. It is the most arrogant and naive notion a sentient mind can conceive. You're wrong! Izuku shouted, his fists clenched at his sides. He was just a boy arguing with a ghost in a dream, but this felt more real and more important than any argument he had ever had. Being a hero isn't about being arrogant. It's about helping people who can't help themselves. It's about putting others before yourself. It's about never giving up. All might. You're all might. Val-El snapped, his form flaring with bright, angry static. A single, powerful man. And what happens when he is gone? What happens when he falters? Your society places its faith in individuals, making them gods. It is a fatal flaw. A society's strength should be in its systems, its science, its collective will. My people had that, and we still perished. Your species, a scattered, tribal race that has barely mastered fission, that still kills each other over patches of dirt and differing mythologies. You are doomed to fail on a scale that would make Krypton's end look like a parlor trick. His cold, cynical logic was a battering ram against Izuku's simple, heartfelt belief. Every point he made was sharp, intelligent, and born from a place of unimaginable tragedy. But Izuku couldn't, accept it. To accept it would be to let the last ember of his dream die. It doesn't matter, Izuku said, his voice lowering but losing none of its intensity. Even if you're right, even if we're doomed, it's still worth trying. It's better to try and fail to save one person than to stand by and do nothing while everyone is lost. You said you failed your world. Is it because you didn't try, or because you couldn't succeed? The question struck the ghost like a physical blow. Val-El's form flickered violently. The crumbling walls of the Mind Palace seemed to groan, and dust rained down from the nebulous sky. The sorrow in his eyes intensified, mixed with a fresh, raw anger. I dedicated my life to a solution that was beyond our science, he hissed, the static in his voice rising. I sacrificed everything on the altar of a failed theory while my cousin pursued a more practical, if limited, solution. My failure was one of hubris. A hubris I now see reflected in your naive, childish eyes. You wish to control this power? You wish to wield the fire of a star in a paper cup? It will destroy you. It will consume you. And you will die a meaningless death, having achieved nothing but your own excruciating demise. I don't care, Izuku said, the three words spoken with the absolute certainty of a religious fanatic. If there is even a 1 in a million chance that I can use this to help someone, I have to try. So tell me, is there a way? Val-El stared at him, the ancient, brilliant, and broken scientist looking at the stubborn, foolish, and unbreakable boy. The conflict between them was now stark and clear. One was the voice of cynical, pragmatic reason, born from catastrophic failure. The other was the voice of irrational, unwavering heroism, born from a pure and simple dream. Two minds in one body, diametrically opposed, yet inextricably linked. The ghost turned away, his translucent back to Izuku. He floated back towards the flickering star map, a solitary figure in the grand ruin of his own memory. Theoretically, Val-El finally said, his voice a low, weary murmur that echoed in the vastness. Control is a matter of biological integration and energy regulation. But the science, the technology required, it does not exist on this world. It is impossible. The dream was beginning to fray at the edges. The static grew louder, the crystalline floor turning fuzzy. The weight of his real body, of his real pain, was starting to pull him back. Nothing is impossible, Izuku said, his final, defiant declaration against the encroaching darkness. Not if you're a hero. Val-El did not answer. The static swelled to a roar, and the magnificent, tragic ruin of the Kryptonian laboratory dissolved into nothingness. Izuku woke with a gasp, his body jerking on his mattress. The morning sun streamed through his window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. His sheets were damp with sweat, his head throbbed, and the familiar aches were all present and accounted for, perhaps even a little sharper than usual. He sat up, his heart still racing from the argument with the ghost. He looked at his hands, turning them over and over. It had felt so real. The voice, Val-El, was still a clear echo in his mind. A biological nuclear reactor with no shielding. It is a death sentence. He swung his legs out of bed and stood, his body protesting with a groan. He walked to his desk and looked at the notebook Bakugo had tossed aside. Hero analysis for the future. The words seemed both foolish and more important than ever. The dream hadn't given him answers, not easy ones. It had given him a truth far more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. He wasn't just a quirkless boy with a dream. He was Izuku Midoriya, the dying vessel of a resurrected Kryptonian spirit named Val-El. His body was a battlefield, his power was a poison, and a cynical ghost now lived in his head. And yet, as he looked at the All Might poster on his wall, at the brilliant, unwavering smile, the core of his being, the one thing that had never changed, remained steadfast. He was in pain. He was breaking down. He was, by all logical accounts, doomed. But he was still going to be a hero. Now, he just had to figure out how to do it without turning into radioactive dust. The path forward was no longer just difficult. It was, as Val-El had said, impossible. And Izuku Midoriya was going to walk it anyway. The days following the dream were a strange, tense new reality for Izuku. The world outside hadn't changed, but the world within him had been irrevocably altered. The voice of Val-El was a constant, low-level hum in the back of his mind, a background static of cynical commentary and unsolicited scientific observations. The structural integrity of that bridge is subpar. The tensile strength of the support cables is compromised by oxidation. A minor seismic event would be catastrophic. The voice would murmur as Izuku walked to school, "Your instructor's understanding of historical causation is remedial at best. He attributes societal shifts to individual actions rather than systemic socioeconomic pressures. Inefficient. The nutritional content of this meal is suboptimal. High in sodium and simple carbohydrates. It will lead to a temporary spike in energy followed by a notable crash. Your biological vessel requires a more balanced nutrient profile to sustain its cellular repair functions." Izuku did his best to ignore it. He tried to treat it like a particularly persistent and gloomy inner monologue. But it was difficult when the voice was so clearly other. It was a constant reminder of the alien ghost haunting his DNA, of the Kryptonian time bomb ticking in his cells. The knowledge Val-El had imparted sat like a lead weight in his gut. Every ache, every twinge of fatigue, was no longer just a symptom of a nameless condition. It was a specific data point charting his slow, inevitable decay. He found himself standing in front of the mirror more often, searching for signs. Were the circles under his eyes darker? Was his skin paler? He'd press his fingers into the flesh of his arm, half expecting it to feel brittle, to crumble like the walls of Val-El's mind palace. The fear was a constant companion, a cold shadow that clung to him throughout the day. But alongside the fear, a new, fragile determination was taking root. If he was truly dying, then what was the point of hiding? What was the point of his quiet, painful, invisible life? The dream of being a hero, once a distant, shimmering star, now felt like the only thing that mattered. If his time was limited, he wanted to make it count. He wanted to do something, anything, that would prove Val-El's crushing cynicism wrong. It was this thought that propelled him through another grueling school day. He endured the usual taunts, the casual dismissals from his teachers, and the ever-present, intimidating orbit of Bakugo. The final bell rang, and Izuku packed his bag, the familiar ache in his joints a dull, rhythmic beat. He was halfway out the door when the teacher called out, "Oh, Midoriya. You're planning on applying to UA too, aren't you?" The classroom, which had been buzzing with a dozen different conversations, fell silent. Every head turned to stare at him. Izuku froze, his hand on the doorframe, his blood turning to ice. Laughter erupted, sharp and cruel. "Him? UA? He's quirkless. You can't get into the hero course without a quirk, idiot." Izuku flinched with every word, each one a tiny paper cut on his already frayed nerves. Then came the explosion he'd been dreading. DKU. Bakugo's hand slammed down on his desk, a small, sharp crack of a miniature explosion charring the wood. He stalked towards Izuku, his eyes blazing with a furious, incredulous rage. "Don't you dare lump me in with this loser!" Bakugo snarled at the teacher, before turning his full, terrifying attention on Izuku. He grabbed the front of Izuku's uniform, smoke curling from his palms. You think you can stand in the same ring as me? You're worse than the rest of these rejects, you quirkless wannabe. You'd die in the exams. You're already dying, Velel's voice echoed in his mind, calm and detached. His assessment, while crudely delivered, is not inaccurate. The mortality rate for UA applicants without combat viable abilities is statistically significant. Izuku trembled in Bakugo's grip, unable to speak, unable to meet the burning crimson eyes. The memory of pushing him, of the searing pain and the gushing blood, held him paralyzed. He was a rabbit in the glare of a predator's headlights. Bakugo, getting no reaction, shoved him away in disgust. Don't even think about applying, he spat, or I'll end you. He shouldered past Izuku and left, his lackeys following him out. Izuku stood there, shaking, his uniform still smelling of burnt sugar and ozone. He gathered his things and fled, his face burning with shame. He took a longer route home, walking beneath an overpass to avoid any more human contact. He needed to be alone. His mind was a chaotic jumble of Bakugo's threats and Velel's cold logic. Both of them were telling him the same thing. He was useless, hopeless, and doomed. He stopped, his gaze falling upon his notebook, which had fallen from his bag during the earlier confrontation. He picked it up from the ground. It was Hero Analysis for the Future, number 13. He stared at the cover, his own hopeful, childish handwriting mocking him. What was the point? Perhaps you should consider a more realistic ambition, Velel suggested from the quiet depths of his consciousness. Archivist. Data analyst. Your pattern recognition skills are above average. These are viable, low-stress career paths that would not accelerate your cellular degradation. Shut up, Izuku whispered to himself, clutching the notebook tighter. As if summoned by his despair, a new sound reached him. A gurgling, sloshing noise coming from the storm drain behind him. He turned, his eyes widening in horror as a monstrous form erupted from the manhole cover. It was a nightmare made of green, viscous sludge, a hulking, amorphous mass with two large, crazed eyes and a gaping mouth filled with yellow teeth. It smelled of raw sewage and decay. A medium-sized meat suit. The sludge villain roared, its voice wet and distorted. You'll do perfectly. Before Izuku could even scream, the villain lunged. Sludge shot forward, enveloping him like a foul, suffocating wave. It poured into his mouth, his nose, his ears. It was thick, heavy, and tasted of filth. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. His frantic struggles were useless against the fluid, overwhelming mass. Panic, primal and absolute, seized him. His lungs burned. Black spots danced in his vision. He was drowning on dry land. Your body is experiencing acute oxygen deprivation, Velel's voice noted, a chillingly calm report from a sinking ship. Cardiac arrest will occur in approximately 45 seconds. Adrenaline is spiking, but without a viable physical response, it is merely accelerating resource consumption. This is it then. An ignominious end. The detached finality of the voice, the sheer acceptance of his death, snapped something in Izuku. No, not like this. I won't die like this. He clawed desperately at the sludge constricting his throat, his nails scraping uselessly. He needed air. He needed to fight back. The fear and desperation coalesced into a single, explosive point of will, and for the first time in 10 years, he didn't try to suppress the power. He reached for it. He called to the slumbering monster in his cells, begging it for help. A surge of unfamiliar energy, hot and wild, answered the call. It wasn't the slow, agonizing burn he was used to. It was a violent, solar flare of power erupting from his core. It flooded his limbs, supercharging his muscles with Kryptonian might. With a choked, desperate roar, he thrashed. It wasn't a calculated move. It was a pure, instinctual spasm of survival. His arms, now imbued with impossible strength, tore through the semi-liquid body of the villain. It was like ripping through thick, wet clay. He tore a momentary gap in the sludge around his face, giving him just enough space to gasp a single, life-giving breath of air. The villain howled in surprise and pain. What the? How are you? The cost was instantaneous and catastrophic. A pain unlike anything he had ever felt exploded through his arms. It wasn't a clean break. It was a feeling of his very bones being ground into dust, of his muscles being shredded from the inside out, of his nerves being set on fire. It was the agony of 1,000 simultaneous compound fractures. But he had an inch. He had a breath. And that was all he needed. Suddenly, a loud clang echoed through the underpass. The manhole cover that the villain had burst through went flying, sent spinning into the wall by an unseen force. "Have no fear, you are safe," a voice boomed, deep and familiar, radiating confidence and power. "For I am here." A mountain of a man landed between Izuku and the sewer grate. He was impossibly tall, impossibly broad, with a smile that could banish shadows and 2 iconic tufts of golden hair that stood up like rabbit ears. All Might. It was him. In the flesh. His hero. His god. The sludge villain recoiled. "All Might? Texas." "Smaz." All Might threw a punch. He didn't even make contact with the villain. The punch itself was a detonation. The sheer air pressure it generated was a physical force, a focused hurricane that hit the sludge villain like a solid wall. The villain's semi-liquid body disintegrated, splattering against the walls and ceiling of the underpass in 1,000 green droplets. The wind pressure washed over Izuku, blowing the remaining sludge off him and clearing his lungs. He collapsed to the ground, gasping, his body trembling, his arms screaming with an agony so profound it felt white-hot. He could feel the dislocated joints, the torn ligaments, the deep, internal bleeding. Through the haze of his pain, he watched as All Might efficiently gathered the villain's remains into a soda bottle. "Thought I'd lost him in the sewers," All Might said, his booming voice slightly breathless. He turned to Izuku, his signature smile firmly in place. "But all is well. You were very brave, my boy. I'm glad you're unharmed." Unharmed. The irony was so bitter it almost made Izuku laugh, but all he could manage was a pained groan. He tried to push himself up, but his arms were useless, flopping at his sides like broken twigs. My notebook," Izuku rasped, his eyes landing on the singed and now sludge-stained journal. "Can you?" "Of course. An autograph from a fan is the lifeblood of a hero." All Might boomed. He picked up the notebook, flipped to a clean page, and scrawled his massive signature across 2 pages. He handed it back to Izuku. "There you go. Now, I must be off. Justice waits for no man." "Wait!" Izuku cried, a surge of desperation cutting through his pain. This was it. This was his one chance. The one person in the world who might understand, who might have an answer. He had to ask. He had to know. As All Might crouched, preparing for a mighty leap, Izuku did something incredibly stupid and incredibly reckless. He scrambled forward, ignoring the fire in his arms and legs, and latched onto All Might's leg. "A fan with initiative, I see." All Might laughed, and then he jumped. The world became a blur of wind and roaring air. The pressure was immense. Izuku clung on for dear life, his face pressed against the rough fabric of All Might's trousers. "This is an illogical course of action," Bellel's voice noted, surprisingly calm amidst the chaos. "The G-forces alone should be sufficient to detach you. Your grip strength is currently anomalous." They landed with a gentle thud on the roof of a nearby department store. All Might gently peeled Izuku off his leg. "Young man, that was incredibly dangerous." All Might scolded, his smile gone, replaced by a stern frown. "I love my fans, but there are limits." He began to walk towards the edge of the roof. "Now I really must go." "No, please," Izuku pleaded, stumbling after him. "I have to ask you something." All Might paused, his broad back to Izuku. "I don't have time for. Can someone without a quirk become a hero like you?" Izuku blurted out, the words tumbling out in a rush of desperate hope. "Can I be a hero, even if I'm quirkless?" It was the question that had haunted him his entire life. The question his mother couldn't answer. The question Bakugo and the world had already answered for him. He needed to hear it from All Might. There was a long silence. All Might stood unmoving, the wind whipping at his costume. "Without a quirk," he began, his voice strangely subdued. He turned, and Izuku's world shattered for the second time in his life. The man who turned to face him was not All Might. The mountain of muscle was gone, replaced by a skeletal, emaciated figure with sharp, angular features and sunken eyes. His clothes hung loosely on his shrunken frame. A plume of steam hissed from his body, and he coughed, a thin trickle of blood appearing at the corner of his mouth. Izuku stared, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. You're not All Might, you're a fake. An imposter, I assure you. I am All Might, the skeletal man said, his voice now quiet and raspy. He lifted his shirt, revealing a horrific, starburst-shaped scar that covered the entire left side of his torso. It was a crater of mangled flesh and twisted scar tissue, a wound so grievous it was a miracle he was even standing. I got this in a fight 5 years ago, he explained, his voice heavy with weariness. It destroyed my respiratory system and removed my stomach. I can only do my hero work for about 3 hours a day now. The form you know is me flexing, puffing out my chest to hide this. Izuku felt sick. The symbol of peace was broken. All Might sank to the ground, leaning against the rooftop railing. To answer your question, no. I cannot simply say, you can become a hero even without a power. The words were a physical blow. Izuku felt the last ember of hope inside him finally extinguish, leaving nothing but cold, black ash. Of course. It was always going to be the answer. Val-El was right. Bakugo was right. The doctor was right. It's a dangerous line of work, All Might continued, his voice soft with a sympathy that was almost worse than contempt. Pro-heroes are always risking their lives. Some villains just can't be beaten without a power. So no. I don't think you can be a hero without a quirk. Izuku's head drooped. His vision blurred with tears. The pain in his arms, which he had been trying to ignore, came roaring back, a screaming crescendo of agony. It didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered. If you want to help people, All Might said, trying to be kind, you could always become a police officer. They get a bad rap because they're often cleaning up after heroes, but it's a fine and respectable profession. He stood up, wincing. It's not bad to dream, kid. Just make sure your dreams are realistic. He turned and walked towards the rooftop access door, leaving Izuku alone with his shattered reality and his screaming, broken body. Izuku fell to his knees, tears finally tracking silently down his face. He didn't even notice that the pain in his arms was different now. It was no longer a sharp, shattering agony. It was a deep, searing burn, and he could feel a strange, unnatural warmth spreading from the injuries. His cells, supercharged and damaged, were now trying to heal at an impossible, accelerated rate, a process that was almost as painful as the injury itself. Suddenly, a loud explosion rocked the city block below. Both Izuku and All Might whipped their heads around. A plume of black smoke was rising from a shopping arcade a few streets over. Damn it, All Might muttered, clutching his side. I'm out of time. He hurried down the stairs, leaving Izuku to his despair. Izuku just knelt there, numb. It was over. The dream was dead. Val-El's voice was silent in his head, offering no commentary, no I told you so. It was a silence more damning than any criticism. He didn't know how long he sat there. 5 minutes? 10? Eventually, the self-pity gave way to a dull, throbbing emptiness. He mechanically wiped his face and staggered to his feet, his arms hanging limply, pulsing with a painful, radiating heat. He made his way to the stairwell and began the long, slow journey down. He emerged back onto the street, joining a crowd of people who were all running towards the commotion. Against his better judgment, against every instinct screaming at him to go home and lick his wounds, Izuku found himself being carried along with the tide. He broke through the front of the crowd and his blood ran cold. It was the sludge villain again. The bottles must have fallen from All Might's pocket during their rooftop encounter. And it had found a new hostage. It was a boy with spiky, ash-blonde hair, thrashing and struggling, setting off explosions that were doing nothing but setting the nearby shops on fire. Bakugo. The heroes on the scene were helpless. Death Arms couldn't get a solid grip. Kamui Woods was useless against the fire. Backdraft was busy trying to contain the blaze, and All Might was standing in the crowd, in his skeletal form, clutching his side and cursing his own weakness. No one was doing anything. They were all waiting for a hero with the right quirk to show up. Meanwhile, Bakugo was suffocating. His eyes, once so full of rage and arrogance, were now wide with terror and pleading for help, and then their eyes met. For a single, electric moment, Izuku saw past the bully, past the tormentor. He saw a terrified kid who was going to die. He didn't think. He didn't plan. He didn't weigh the consequences. The cynical voice of Val-El, the crushing words of All Might, the decade of fear and pain, all of it vanished. His legs just moved. He broke through the police line, a small, green-haired boy sprinting towards a life-or-death situation that seasoned heroes couldn't handle. "Get back here, you idiot!" Death Arms yelled. "Stop! You'll get yourself killed! Illogical!" Val-El's voice screamed in his head, no longer calm, but filled with a sudden, frantic alarm. "Your vessel is already severely damaged. Further exertion will lead to systemic failure. Abort! This is suicide." Izuku ignored it. He ran, his mind a blank slate of pure, unadulterated instinct. He needed to do something, anything. His eyes darted around, his brain, honed by years of hero analysis, kicking into overdrive. The villain's eyes. They were solid. A weak point. He swung his backpack off his shoulders and hurled it at the villain's face. A direct hit. A heavy textbook smacked the villain square in the eye, causing it to roar in pain and recoil slightly. It gave him an opening. It gave Bakugo a precious second to gasp for air. "Kaken!" Izuku screamed as he reached the thrashing morass of sludge. He started digging. He clawed at the sludge around Bakugo's face with his bare hands. The power, which he wasn't even consciously calling on, surged through his damaged arms. The searing pain of his earlier injuries intensified tenfold, but he didn't stop. He dug and tore, his fingers, which should have been broken and useless, now moving with a desperate, unnatural strength. The sludge felt thick and viscous, but it yielded to him, tearing like wet paper under his assault. "Deku? What the hell are you doing here?" Bakugo choked out, his eyes wide with disbelief. "I don't know," Izuku cried, tears streaming down his face, a wild, terrified grin stretched across his lips. "My legs just started moving. I just couldn't watch you die." He looked at Bakugo, his expression a frantic, tear-streaked mirror of the hero he so admired. "You looked like you needed saving." In the crowd, All Might stared, his sunken eyes wide. He saw the quirkless, broken boy he had just dismissed, performing an act of pure, selfless, reckless heroism that shamed every pro on the scene. He saw the same spirit he had seen in his own master, Nana Shimura. The spirit of a true hero. He clutched his bleeding side, a fire long thought extinguished reigniting in his chest. Pathetic, he thought to himself. Pathetic. He began to bulk up, steam pouring from his body. "I must practice what I preach." Back at the center of the inferno, the sludge villain had recovered. It raised a massive tendril to swat Izuku away like a fly. This is it, Izuku thought, his frantic digging never ceasing. He was going to die. But he had tried. He had done something. Suddenly, a massive hand grabbed his shoulder, pulling him back. All Might stood there, in his full, heroic glory, a trickle of blood at the corner of his magnificent smile. "I really am pathetic," he said, his voice a low rumble. He planted his feet. "I told you the traits that make a great hero, but I see now I wasn't living up to my own ideals." He grabbed Bakugo's arm, locking his grip. "Pros are always risking their lives. That's the true test of a hero." He reared back his other arm. "Detroit. Smayas." The punch was even more powerful than the first. It was a focused explosion of power that not only obliterated the sludge villain but also changed the weather. The force of the blow created a powerful updraft, causing the clouds above to part and rain to fall, extinguishing the fires in an instant. Silence. And then, the crowd erupted in a deafening roar. Izuku lay on the wet pavement, his body screaming, his adrenaline gone, leaving behind only an ocean of pain. Bakugo was being praised for his bravery. Izuku was being scolded by the heroes for his recklessness. He didn't hear any of it. He just felt numb. He had acted. He had saved Kaken. And now he was paying the price, his arms feeling like they were full of molten lead. Later, as he was walking home, the sun setting on the longest, most painful day of his life, a voice called out, "DKU." He turned. It was Bakugo, running to catch up. I never asked for your help, he yelled, his face a mixture of anger and confusion. And you didn't help me. Got it? I was fine by myself. So don't you dare look down on me. You damn nerd. And with that, he turned and stalked off. Primitive primate dominance displays, Val-El noted dryly. His ego is unable to process gratitude, so it manifests as aggression. Fascinatingly inefficient. Izuku watched him go, a small, sad smile on his face. He turned to continue his slow, painful walk home. I am here, the voice boomed from a side street. All Might, in his hero form, zipped out, striking a pose. All Might? What are you doing here? Weren't you swarmed by reporters? Izuku stammered. Getting away from them was a piece of cake. For I am All My blog. He deflated instantly, steam hissing as he reverted to his skeletal form, another trickle of blood running down his chin. Young man, he said, his voice now serious and quiet. I have come to thank you. And to apologize. And to make a proposition. Izuku stared confused. In that moment, All Might said, his sunken eyes locking onto Izuku's. When all the other heroes stood still, you acted. You, a timid, quirkless boy, were the most heroic person there. You moved before you had a chance to think. He took a step closer. There are stories about all the great heroes. Most of them have one thing in common. Their bodies moved before they had a chance to think. Izuku's eyes welled up with fresh tears. That is what happened to you back there, isn't it? Izuku, unable to speak, just nodded, sobbing. All Might smiled, a genuine, tired, but incredibly warm smile. Young man, you too can become a hero. The words he had been waiting his entire life to hear. They washed over him, a healing balm on his shattered spirit. I have been searching for a successor, All Might continued, his voice filled with a new, profound gravity. And I have decided. It is you. Izuku looked up, his face a mess of tears and confusion. A successor? My quirk is not like the others, All Might explained. It is not something I was born with. It is a sacred torch, passed down from one generation to the next. It is a power that is cultivated, stockpiled, and bestowed. The name of my quirk is One for All. Izuku's mind, which had been shutting down, rebooted with a jolt. A passed-on power? A stockpiling quirk? It explained All Might's incredible strength. And I, All Might said, gesturing towards Izuku with an open palm, deem you worthy of inheriting my power. Izuku stared, his jaw hanging open. He, Izuku Midoriya, the quirkless, broken boy, was being offered the power of the number one hero in the world. But as the initial shock subsided, a cold wave of dread washed over him, extinguishing the newborn flame of hope. He looked down at his own arms, which were still throbbing with a deep, alien pain. He already had a power. A secret power. A Kryptonian power that was a curse, a poison that was slowly, agonizingly killing him. Val-El's voice, silent for so long, returned. It was no longer cynical or detached. It was filled with an urgent, palpable alarm, a scientist's frantic terror in the face of an unknown, catastrophic variable. No! The ghost in his mind screamed. Do not accept! Your system is already critically unstable. You are a vessel filled to the brim with a volatile energy you cannot contain. To add a second, unknown energy source of this magnitude, the reaction would be unpredictable. It could be synergistic, or it could catalyze a complete systemic collapse. It could annihilate you from within. It is a second poison. Do not do it, Izuku Midoriya. Refuse. The terror in Val-El's voice was infectious. But then Izuku looked up at All Might. He saw the hope in the hero's eyes. He saw the chance, not just to be a hero, but to be a hero like him. To be strong, to have control. To save people with a smile. Maybe One for All wasn't another poison. Maybe it was the antidote. Maybe it was the key, the one thing that could help him control the Kryptonian curse, to tame the monster within. It was an impossible choice. A gamble with his own life, his own soul. On one side, the logical, terrified pleading of the ancient scientist in his head. On the other, the outstretched hand of his idol, offering him the dream he'd held since he was a child. He looked at All Might, tears streaming down his face, a decision born of desperation and a lifetime of hope solidifying in his heart. I accept. The sun had not yet risen, but Dagoba Municipal Beach Park was already bathed in a soft, pre-dawn luminescence. The air was cool and tasted of salt and decay. For decades, ocean currents had conspired to turn this once scenic stretch of coastline into a landfill. It was a mountain range of forgotten things, rusted appliances, tangled fishing nets, broken furniture, and towering stacks of garbage bags, all woven together into a monument of urban neglect. And on top of the highest peak of trash, silhouetted against the pale violet sky, stood the skeletal figure of Toshinori Yagi. This, he announced, gesturing grandly at the sea of refuse with a bony arm, is your training ground. Izuku Midoriya stood on the sand below, his gaze sweeping over the junk-heap mountain. He was exhausted. He'd barely slept, his mind a frantic pinball machine bouncing between All Might's incredible offer and Valel's dire, terrified warnings. The ghost in his head had been a ceaseless torrent of static and frantic, half-formed Kryptonian equations all night, a psychic manifestation of a panic attack. All this? Izuku stammered, his eyes wide. I have to move all this. Exactly. Toshinori beamed, his smile looking almost ghastly on his emaciated face. You see, my quirk, one for all, is the ultimate physical ability. It's a hurricane of pure power. Your body, as it is now, is not a proper vessel. If you were to inherit it, your limbs would pop right off. Izuku paled, his hands instinctively flying to his arms. His analogy is crude, but the principle is sound. Valel's voice murmured in his mind. The frantic edge was gone, replaced by a grim, analytical tone. Your musculature and bone density are inadequate to channel significant kinetic energy. However, his assessment is incomplete. He is unaware that the vessel is already filled with a volatile, radioactive substance. So, Toshinori continued, hopping down from the trash heap with surprising agility, you must first forge your body into a worthy chalice. You will spend the next 10 months, until the UA entrance exam, cleaning this entire section of the beach. You will build up your muscles, strengthen your core, and prepare your body to receive my power. He produced a sheaf of papers from his pocket with a flourish. I have prepared a custom workout plan for you. Aim to pass. American Dream Plan. It details every aspect of your life, from your workout regimen to your sleep schedule, for the next 10 months. Izuku took the papers, his hands trembling slightly. It was real. This was happening. He was being trained by All Might himself. A giddy, hysterical joy bubbled up inside him, momentarily eclipsing the fear and the chronic pain. The first few weeks were hell. The American Dream Plan was brutal. It was a relentless cycle of hauling, lifting, pushing, and pulling, all designed to break down and rebuild every muscle fiber in his body. For a normal, healthy teenager, it would have been grueling. For Izuku, it was a special kind of torture. His baseline was already exhaustion. His body was a constant, low-grade war zone, perpetually diverting energy to repair the microscopic damage from the Kryptonian radiation. Now, he was adding intense, deliberate physical strain on top of it. Every morning, he would drag himself out of bed, his body already screaming in protest, and meet Toshinori at the beach. He would work for hours, his muscles burning, his lungs gasping for air. The deep, familiar aches in his joints sharpened into constant, stabbing pains. He'd go to school in a daze, his mind foggy with fatigue, then return to the beach in the afternoon to work until his body gave out. He collapsed more times than he could count. He'd be trying to drag a rusted refrigerator. His muscles would simply quit, and he'd fall face first into the sand, every cell in his body screaming for reprieve. Toshinori was a surprisingly strict taskmaster. He'd stand over Izuku, arms crossed, offering encouragement that sounded suspiciously like yelling. Come on, young Midoriya. This is only the beginning. Heroes have to push past their limits every day, but there were quieter moments too. After Izuku would inevitably collapse, Toshinori would sit with him, offering him a water bottle and talking about what it truly meant to be a hero. He spoke of courage, of sacrifice, of the unwavering smile that was a promise to the frightened. In those moments, Izuku would find the strength to get up and try again. An unexpected, and sometimes helpful, side effect of the training was Val-El. The Kryptonian spirit, after his initial frantic objections, had shifted into a mode of pragmatic, resentful observation. He saw the training not as a path to heroism, but as a dangerous variable he needed to manage to ensure the survival of his host vessel. "Your form is inefficient," the voice would critique as Izuku struggled to lift a waterlogged sofa. "You are placing undue strain on your lumbar spine. Engage your core. Lift with your legs. Distribute the load more evenly." The principles of leverage are universal. Izuku, desperate for any relief, started listening. He adjusted his grip as Val-El instructed. He changed his posture. And to his astonishment, it helped. The load felt a little lighter, the strain a little less focused. "Your breathing is erratic," Val-El noted as Izuku gasped for air. "You are hyperventilating, leading to an improper oxygen-carbon dioxide balance. Regulate your breaths. Inhale through the nose, exhale through the mouth. Synchronize it with your movements. It will improve your stamina." A strange, reluctant partnership began to form. Izuku provided the will, the raw, stubborn determination to keep going. Val-El provided the cold, hard science, the biomechanical analysis that made the impossible task marginally more bearable. Tashinori would watch, puzzled, as Izuku would sometimes pause, tilt his head as if listening to an unheard voice, and then adjust his technique with surprising insight. "You're a quick learner, young Midoriya," he'd boom. Just thinking about the physics of it all, Izuku would lie, his face flushed with exertion. But even with Val-El's reluctant coaching, the physical toll was immense. The migraines became more frequent. The fatigue was a lead cloak he could never take off. Some nights, the pain in his bones was so intense that he would lie awake, curled in a ball, silently weeping into his pillow. He was pushing his decaying body far beyond its breaking point, and both he and the ghost in his head knew it. "The rate of your cellular degradation has increased by approximately 17%, Val-El informed him one night in the dream lab. The Mind Palace was even more dilapidated than before, the cracks in the crystal wider, the static thicker. "You are accelerating the decay. You are trading long-term viability for short-term muscular gain. It is an unsustainable equation." "I have to," Izuku said, his dream self looking haggard and worn. "It's the only way." He was walking a razor's edge, trying to build a body strong enough to hold one for all before his internal Kryptonian curse destroyed it completely. Months passed. The mountain of trash began to shrink. And Izuku's body began to change. The scrawny, hunched boy was replaced by someone with lean, corded muscle. He was still small, but there was a new, hard-won strength in his frame. The day finally came, on the very morning of the UA entrance exam, when Izuku stood before a completely clean, pristine stretch of beach. He had done it. He had moved the entire mountain. He climbed atop the last massive piece of junk, a broken-down industrial freezer, and raised his arms to the rising sun, letting out a raw, triumphant scream that was 10 months in the making. Tashinori stood on the boardwalk, a proud, tearful smile on his face. He powered up into his all-might form, the transformation a dramatic burst of steam and swelling muscle. Oh my goodness!" he roared, rushing over to Izuku. "You even cleaned outside the area I designated. You did it! You magnificent bastard!" He whipped out his phone to show Izuku a picture of himself from 10 months prior, a scrawny, tear-streaked boy. "Look at you! You did it! You worked so hard." Izuku collapsed, exhausted but victorious. All Might caught him. "Now," he said, his voice dropping to a serious, reverent tone. "It is time for you to receive your reward." He plucked a single, golden hair from his head. "The culmination of your heroic journey," All Might declared, holding the strand of hair out to Izuku. "For you to inherit my power." He paused for dramatic effect. "You must eat this." Izuku stared. "Huh!" After a moment of confused protest, he did as he was told. He took the strand of hair, his fingers trembling, and swallowed it. It felt anticlimactic, and a little gross. For a moment, nothing happened. Izuku felt the same exhaustion, the same deep aches. He felt the low thrum of the Kryptonian energy, a familiar, unwelcome hum. Then it began. It started as a flicker, a spark deep within him, as the DNA encoded in All Might's hair follicle was absorbed into his system. This spark touched the raging, radioactive sea of Kryptonian energy that already filled him, and the sea erupted. It was not a transfer of power. It was a chemical reaction. A detonation. Izuku's body seized. A scream was torn from his throat, raw and inhuman. He fell to the sand, his back arching, his limbs convulsing uncontrollably. It was 1,000 times worse than when he first touched the Genesis crystal. That had been an overwhelming influx of alien energy. This was a war. The nascent, pure energy of One for All, a power meant to be a heroic torch, reacted with the volatile, alien radiation of a dead star. The two energies, one orderly and stockpiled, the other chaotic and decaying, crashed into each other like matter and antimatter within the confines of his own cells. A terrifying light began to shine from within him. It wasn't the heroic gold of One for All, nor the sickly green he sometimes associated with the Kryptonian curse. It was a violent, unstable fusion of the two. His veins began to glow through his skin, a spiderweb of angry, red-gold light. The energy was arcing, uncontrolled, tearing through him. Young Midoriya! All Might yelled in horror, dropping to his knees beside the convulsing boy. He had expected some discomfort, perhaps a fever as the power settled. Not this. This was a body rejecting an organ transplant on a catastrophic, explosive scale. In his mind, Izuku was no longer in the dream lab. He was adrift in a raging storm of pure energy. Red and gold lightning cracked all around him. Val-El was there, a frantic, screaming specter being torn apart and reformed by the maelstrom. Unstable. The energies are not integrating. They are competing. It's a cascading chain reaction. The vessel is rupturing at the cellular level. It's a meltdown. A complete systemic meltdown. Izuku could feel it. He could feel his cells being ripped apart, supercharged, and then annihilated in a continuous, agonizing cycle. The pain was absolute, a universe of pure sensation with no beginning and no end. He was coming apart, atom by atom. Hold on, my boy. Hold on. All Might shouted, his voice filled with a desperate, rising panic. He didn't know what to do. He had never heard of anything like this happening. He had made a terrible mistake. He had given his power to a boy whose body, for some unknown reason, was utterly, fatally incompatible with it. He hadn't given him a gift. He had administered a lethal dose of poison. He gathered the convulsing, glowing boy into his arms. He had to get him help. But where? A public hospital was out of the question. The secret of One for All could not be exposed. There was only one person he could trust. He powered down, the transformation barely registering in his panic, and fumbled for his phone. His hands shook so badly it took him 3 tries to dial the number. Naomasa, he said, his voice strained and cracking. I need a secure line. Now. It's my successor. Something's gone wrong. Horribly wrong. The room was sterile white and smelled of ozone and advanced medicine. Izuku floated in and out of consciousness, each waking moment a fresh wave of agony. He was hooked up to a dozen machines, their screens displaying frantic, erratic readouts that made no sense. A woman with a stern face and a quirk that let her extrude syringe needles from her fingertips was drawing another vial of his strangely glowing blood. He was in a private, high-tech medical facility hidden in a sub-basement of the police headquarters. A place so secret that most of the force didn't even know it existed. It was a clinic for heroes with sensitive injuries and for cases, like this one, that defied conventional understanding. Tashinori sat in a chair by the bed, looking smaller and older than Izuku had ever seen him. The guilt was a physical weight, bowing his already stooped shoulders. He hadn't left Izuku's side in 2 days. The door slid open, and a man in a crisp white lab coat entered. He was a tall, thin man with graying hair and intelligent, weary eyes behind his spectacles. This was Dr. Eris Thorne, one of the world's foremost experts on quirks and their biological impact, and one of the few people who knew Tashinori's secret. Any change? Tashinori asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. His convulsions have stopped, but his condition remains critical, Dr. Thorne said, his professional calm doing little to hide his deep concern. He studied the readouts on the monitors. Tashinori, what you've done. I know, Toshinori croaked, burying his face in his hands. I thought he was ready. His body was strong. I never imagined. It's not about the strength of his muscles, the doctor interrupted, his voice sharp. We've analyzed his blood work. His genetic markers. What we've found is impossible. He brought up a complex diagram on a large screen. It showed two swirling vortexes of energy, one a brilliant gold, the other a sickly, chaotic red. One for all is present, Dr. Thorne explained, pointing to the golden vortex. It's trying to integrate, to settle into his cells as it should. But it can't. There's something else already there. A second energy signature, one unlike any quirk factor I have ever encountered. He pointed to the red vortex. This energy, it's not biological in the traditional sense. It behaves more like a form of high-level, exotic radiation. It's bonded to his DNA, suffused through every cell in his body. And it's profoundly unstable. It's causing his cells to decay even as it empowers them. It's like he's been living with a slow-acting radiological poison his entire life. Toshinori looked up, his face ashen. A poison? And you just introduced the second, massive energy source into that already volatile system, Dr. Thorne finished grimly. The two energies are at war. They are ripping his cellular structure apart. One for all is trying to build him up, to empower him, while this other energy is trying to consume him. Using either power would be dangerous for him, using them together. Toshinori, if he ever tried to channel both at once, the feedback loop could be catastrophic. It could cause a chain reaction on a subcellular level. It wouldn't just break his bones, it could theoretically cause him to detonate. The word hung in the air, cold and heavy. Detonate. All Might, the symbol of peace, felt a crushing guilt that was heavier than any villain he had ever faced. He had looked at this boy, saw his heroic heart, and in his eagerness to find a successor, he had doomed him. He had taken a boy who was already dying and handed him a lit stick of dynamite. On the bed, Izuku groaned, his eyelids fluttering. His consciousness was drifting back to the dreamscape. The storm had subsided, but the Mind Palace was in ruins. The crystalline walls were shattered, the nebulous sky was filled with angry red static, and the holographic displays were all dead. Vala was there, his spectral form more unstable than ever, flickering and phasing in and out of existence. He looked terrified. The equation, the ghost whispered, his voice cracking with static. It is unbalanced. Two unknown variables have been introduced into a system on the verge of collapse. It's insoluble. He was frantically tracing complex Kryptonian formulae in the air with a translucent finger, the symbols dissolving as soon as they were written. He was a scientist faced with an impossible problem, a problem whose failure meant the death of his only remaining link to existence. There has to be a way, Izuku rasped, his dream self feeling as broken as his physical one. There has to be a way? Val scoffed, his fear momentarily giving way to his old cynicism. The way is to cease all activity and hope the reaction fizzles out before it reaches critical mass. The way is to lie in that bed until you expire. No! A way to control it. Izuku insisted. A way to use it. Val stopped his frantic calculations and turned to face Izuku. Control? You want to control a fusion reaction in a glass beaker? It is impossible. You're a bioengineer. Izuku shot back, desperation giving him strength. You said so. You understand this. My body, your energy, and now one for all. There has to be a way to make them work together. The ghost stared at him, his flickering form betraying the frantic thoughts racing through his consciousness. He was a genius, a master of a science 1,000 years beyond Earth's. The problem was impossible, yes, but the challenge, the sheer, insane complexity of it, it was a problem worthy of a mind like his. Slowly, a new hologram flickered to life. It was a diagram of Izuku's cells again, but this time it was more complex. The sickly red of the Kryptonian energy, and the brilliant gold of One for All were swirling around the nucleus, locked in a chaotic, destructive dance. The powers are incompatible, Val began, his voice shifting back to the familiar tone of a lecturer. One is a chaotic, radiative force that metabolizes stellar energy. The other is a kinetic, stockpiled energy that is passed through DNA. They are oil and water, fire and ice. He manipulated the hologram. However, if a bridge could be created, a catalyst, he began to sketch a new component into the diagram, a shimmering, silver pathway that connected the two warring energies, channeling them both through the cell's mitochondria in a single, unified stream. One for all is a unique energy, Valo mused, his scientific curiosity beginning to override his terror. It is designed to be passed on, to merge with a host. It has an inherent adaptability that my people's biology lacks. It is possible, theoretically, that it could be used not as a weapon, but as a regulator. A control rod for the Kryptonian reactor. He looked at Izuku, his translucent eyes burning with a new, dangerous light. It wasn't hope. It was the fierce, obsessive glow of a scientist who has just found the problem of a lifetime. If you could perfectly synchronize the output of both energies, he explained, you might be able to use one for all as a focusing lens, a conduit to channel the raw Kryptonian power in a controlled, directed burst. It would allow you to access the alien strength without the immediate, explosive cellular decay. The power of OFA would act as a temporary shield for your cells, while the Kryptonian energy would provide the fuel. He paused, the hologram flickering ominously. But the synchronization would have to be perfect. Absolute. A single miscalculation, a microsecond of imbalance, and the feedback would be instantaneous and fatal. The detonation your Earth doctor spoke of would not be a metaphor, a solution. A terrifying, impossible, razor-thin solution. But it was a solution. A fragile alliance began to form in the ruins of the Mind Palace, forged not of trust, but of mutual, desperate necessity. The boy who would be a hero, and the ghost who had failed his own world, now had a single, common purpose, to solve the unstable equation that was Izuku Midoriya. When Izuku finally woke for good, the first thing he saw was Toshinori's gaunt, guilt-ridden face. Young Midoriya. I am so sorry, the hero whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I have failed you. I have burdened you with a power that might kill you. Izuku took a shaky breath, the pain in his body a dull, omnipresent roar. No, he rasped. You've given me a chance. He explained the theory, the words of Valel flowing from his own mouth. He spoke of regulators, of conduits, of a fragile symbiosis between the two warring powers. He didn't mention the ghost. He just said it was a feeling, an intuition he had while he was unconscious. Toshinori listened, his eyes wide, a flicker of hope warring with his deep-seated fear. A regulator, it makes a twisted kind of sense. But the risk, it's the only way, Izuku said, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. It's the only path forward. I have to try. He had 10 months of training behind him, a body honed to the peak of human endurance. He had the dream of a hero in his heart. And now, he had two powers at war within him, and a terrifying, razor's-edge theory on how to survive. The UA entrance exam was this morning. His journey was just beginning, and he was already on the verge of self-destruction.